Okay, so hello everybody. Thanks for joining the session of today. As we discussed last session, we are having another guest today. This is Ziwei, who is with us today. We are going to talk about now the discussions on the different research that there is around urbanization, informality, urban informality, but now in different geographies. This is probably going to be something new to many of you, to many of us, actually. With Ziwei, we have met each other some time ago, but I am always curious about her research, and this is going to be a nice opportunity to learn more about what she's doing. So I'm going to make a brief introduction of Ziwei before I give her the floor for a brief presentation of hers. So Ziwei, she's an architect. She graduated as with a Bachelor of Architecture from Southeast University in China. Afterwards, and that's where also we met with Samantha and also with Ziwei. She holds a master in landscape architecture and a master in design studies in urbanism and landscape ecology from the Harvard Graduate School of Design. And she's currently a student in the Ph.D. in the Doctor of Philosophy program at Harvard as well. She's working in China in relation to topics about urbanization, about also the interface with the rural areas in China. She's doing also a very historical type of study. So I'm very curious on the research that she's doing. So the idea for us is today to have, I will say, more informal conversation to learn what Ziwei is working on, her research, but also her perspectives on maybe the broader context of cities and informality, perhaps in China. And also, if I can add there something else, Ziwei, also maybe your experience on researching about these kind of topics from the US, which is also very particular. This is something that we've discussed a little bit with Ziwei, the fact that both of us are researching or working about a different country, working from the US, working from an institution in the global north. So that's maybe something interesting as well to consider there. So we are going to have some minutes for Ziwei to make a brief presentation, and from there we will open it up to questions. So thank you again, Ziwei, for making the time to join us. And yeah, I'll leave you the space for your presentation.
Okay, thanks, Jose, for the kind introduction. I will share my screen. So this is not my main dissertation topic. It's my thoughts on the rural-urban interface in China, and I want to tie it to the informal housing in China with Chinese characteristic that's quite different from Peru. And so the main problem in China's urbanization is the massive rural-urban migrations and China's rural-urban dual-land systems that leave the housing crisis for migrant workers. So the first, I want to step back to look at the larger context to understand the scope and extent of problem of migrant workers, the phenomenon called global depeasantization and globalization. As agrarian markets are integrated with global supply chains organized by big capital, domestic agricultural sector was no longer viewed important for the national economy. Instead, urbanization is viewed as critical to national development, as people are expected to move from laboring in low productivity agriculture to more productive industrial and service sector. The increasing number of rural migrants and corresponding expanding urban slum has been well documented. And so China has faced the similar problem. Although from the outside, China seems slum-free, but as the paper I sent to you all, China's slum has its own conundrum. So these two maps I want to show the phenomenon of migration and urban expansion. On the left one, farmers leave their home and farmland and migrate to the big cities. And the map on the right shows the process of urban expansion by transforming farmland into urban land. And like many places, these migrants has been considered as unofficial migrations without full citizenship. So there's double transformations. One is the transformation from urban land, rural land to urban land, and the other transformation is the identity of farmers, transformed from full-time farmers to part-time farmer workers. In order to understand, so the question is that under this double transformation, where do migrant workers and farmers live in the city? We need to go through the technical part in China to understand the institution arrangements. First, city and the village are governed separately in China. There are rural-urban household registration and dual land system, which are established and revisioned by government multiple times since 1950 as a product of planned economy. The key idea of rural-urban household registration is to separate rural and urban residents and thus provide the basis for resource allocation and tax collection. For urban residents, the hukou system declares strong control over the definition and the distribution of public resources, including residential rights to receive food, clothing, education, and social welfare. For the rural residents, the state assumes no responsibility towards the public goods and leaves them amount of autonomy for the local community in the unit of village to organize their own resources, especially farmland. To compensate the insufficient state support and to restrict the amount of rural population influx into the city, the dual land system incentivizes farmers to stay in rural village through their right to their own land. On the contrary, local city governments own lands to freely develop for any developmental purposes. The separation of land ownership significantly impacts the following developmental trajectory. And keep in mind, in the transfer of rural land to urban land, there's also differentiation between agricultural land and residential land, which I will elaborate later to understand the informal housing in China. Despite the loosening of migrant control during the reform processes, the institutionalized system of household registration continue to regulate migrant flows through the countryside by limiting their ability to get jobs and getting social welfare from the local government. And so now we need to understand the political economy of housing in the cities. First, urbanization needs intense supply of labor. And the city government in China always concerned about over-urbanization. So they, although they allow some flows of rural-urban migrations, but they refuse to provide enough social welfare and public goods for migrant workers by controlling their household restriction system. And that's what the sociology call it just-in-time labor management. And these two aspects make the housing for migrant workers difficult. So remember we talked about the two dual system, both the household system and land system. And so wherever there's category, there's gray areas in between the categories. And that's where the migrant workers has been pushed to reside in. And that also shaped the informal housing with Chinese characteristics. So there are two types of space I want to focus on. First type of space is what McGee called as desa-kota. Desa-kota is deriving by combining the Indonesian words desa meaning village and kota meaning town to describe regions marked by intense mixture of agricultural and non-agricultural activities. The convenient and cheap transportation system often connected to such area facilitates the daily commutes between desa-kota and urban core, of which they are typically on the outskirts. Another important feature of desa-kota is that farmers are transformed from traditional full-time farmers to seasonal farmers. One example is in Chongqing. Some farmer worker resides on the agricultural land that's only designated for agricultural use, not for residential use. Most of farmer workers live in these lands. They also work for the cities, but because they exist outside of the traditional category of rural and urban land, this part of neighborhoods lack administrative clarity, and which lead to weak governance on labor regulation and infrastructural provision. And second type of land is called urban village. They usually exist in the downtown segment of major Chinese city, including Shenzhen and Guangzhou, surrounded by skyscrapers. Urban villages are a unique phenomenon that form part of China's urbanization efforts. When the urban frontiers brought to the village, they used to be located at the outskirts of the city. Government compulsorily purchased some farmland and turned them into urban land, while reserve the residential land due to the high cost to compensate and relocate the villagers. Soon after their purchase, the village tend to dense up their land by turning themselves to be landowners. And they will compete to build larger and higher buildings on their tract of lands beyond density limits. Consequently, most of these areas are heavily populated and crowded with narrow alleys. Inside village, they also usually are dark and damp year-round. The village outside of urban planning to infrastructure construction and other administrative regulations are basically absent in this region. On the other hand, the village served to provide cheap accommodation for the migrant workers. Although the neighborhood always suffer from severe social problems such as crime, drug addiction, and prostitution. So the huge debate on the future of urban village is should authority rebuild it or renew it? Authorities are concerned of any plan that will lead to the negative social effects and instability. But in recent years, Shenzhen government started to tear down the urban village and reconstruct, with the promise to provide more public housing. Chinese government has been always thinking about how to deal with the rural-urban migration, but still keep the two dual systems I mentioned before, the household system and rural-urban dual land system. So there, besides building more public housings, there are another two aspects they want to work on. One is to gradually loosening the mobility in rural urban household system, which means allow some skilled rural migrants to change their household into urban households. So that's the labor side reform. The third measurement Chinese government has been always interested in is rural reconstruction movement. So instead of keeping migrants from entering to a city, they try to make village as a better place with more job opportunities, so that farmers can just keep staying in the village. There are different opinions on this policy too. That probably needs another lecture. Like if village just a dumping ground for Chinese government, or rural reconstruction movement in the end is just another type of urbanization with different names. So that ends my presentation, and any questions are welcome.
Thank you so much, Ziwei, for that presentation and for like introducing us to the Chinese context. I have a few questions, but I'm gonna first let the students ask some if there are any questions. So I don't know if anyone has a question right now and would like to ask it or a comment. Okay, so maybe I'll start and then maybe the students will warm up and ask other questions. So the first question I had was regarding this policy direction. So the last slide that you were showing us, and this like 3 potential avenues of addressing these issues that you presented throughout the presentation. And the first question, I think it's maybe a more direct question, but are all these policies already in place, or are they being discussed like amongst academics or amongst different professional settings? And what do you think, like, if they're already in place, how are they being perceived? And if they're still under discussion, what do you think like the impact or perception will be? Because some of them seem very seem to challenge some systems that have been in place for a very long time in China. Like thinking about a reform of the PUCP system. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, but this like household registration seems like something that might have a lot of maybe pushback from some people. So I was just curious about how that's like, what are the conversations around these policies?
Yeah, that's a very great question. So all these policies has been implemented and experimented by different provinces, and because the policy to have reform all these 3 aspects from the central government, but how they implement it is really dependent by local governments. And sometimes the local government can deflect this question back to the central. For example, if for example, in some big cities, they might allow more migrant workers to change their household system into urban system, but they will not increase the schools in the city. So in the end, migrant workers still find, even if they with urban PUCP system, they still find it hard to have their kids to go to school in the city. So it's an expanded network. PUCP is related to the school, hospital, and all the public goods system. If you only allow them to enter to change the title without expanding other public good provision in the city. It doesn't really include them into the urban citizenship. Does it make sense to you? And so, yeah, it's a way for the government to look like they have implemented the central policy, but in reality, the migrant workers who has changed their ecosystem might still find it hard to retain their citizenship.
Yes, thank you for that. And I think you've raised a very interesting question regarding, because China is a very big country with a lot of differences in different like provinces, like this relationship between like the national government and the local government in implementing these different like policies. I think that's a very important point you're making. And I think one of the other questions that I had was regarding this idea of gray areas, because both the household system and the land system are very dualistic, right? So people and land are being classified either as rural or urban. And by having these two categories, you suggested that there's this gray areas. And I think you were mentioning Maggie's Dakota concept and this idea of the in-between amongst this like dual categories. So maybe you can speak a little bit more about that. I think that's a very important discussion that we're trying to have in class, like what's some of the problems that may raise about having like these very distinct categories that leave a lot of things either in between or out of these categories. So yes, maybe if you can talk a little bit more about that idea of the gray space.
Yeah, the every dualistic system will have its loophole, and sometimes the loophole provide the space for a marginalized community to find space, but sometimes the loopholes also allow for like rent seeking, and some people can even benefit from it. And for the for the first picture I showed, some residents live on the agricultural land. In some cities, true, like most of migrant workers live on that kind of land, but there also in some cities, people try to build luxury housings on that kind of land. Although the property rights of houses built on that kind of gray areas are never protected by government. In 2 years ago, there is a huge news. So it's in the suburban of Beijing. There are many retired professors. They built their own luxury housings on that kind of agricultural land, and they all got teared down by the government. So the outcome of this kind of gray area can be very polemic. But they are both not protected by the government in different ways. I think, but as the urban expansion keep going, the space for this gray area will just become smaller and smaller. If we apply Harvey's spatial fix, it makes sense for this kind of gray area in the end be turned into not that gray area for capital accumulation.
Okay, I'm gonna maybe give a chance to students and Jose Carlos also to ask a few questions if you have some. I still have some things that I would like to discuss more deeply, but maybe let's give the students and Jose Carlos a chance as well.
I can also just add on a little bit
Yes.
more for the first question about the
Mhm.
three policies. And for the rural urbanization, there's some really good books coming out in last year. One book is called The End of Village. It talk about, it's not only government, the city, the central government and city government want to take advantage in the project of rural reconstruction movement. Sometimes local farmers also want to benefit from the rural reconstruction movement. There's the aspiration of being living in a city is so universal in China. In some case, farmers want to make their village look more like city in the rural reconstruction movement. But on the other hand, city government want village to still look like village, to have a pastoral style look. So there's some, yeah, if you take an anthropological perspective to look at the rural reconstruction movement, you'll see how the ideology of rural and urban also transform these projects. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't know. I think also Carlos is having issues with his internet, so I don't know if you're available and you want to ask something, or maybe some of the students. I know this is a very different maybe context to the ones we're used to discussing in classes around like informality. But I think this is a great opportunity to talk more about it. Jose Carlos, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm going to try to. My internet is a little unstable, I'm seeing, so let me know if it interrupts or I can repeat. Maybe I'll turn off my camera just to make it a little better. So I wanted to make one specific question that was whether the concept of informality or urban informality was useful or at least maybe used in the conversations about the process of urbanization or the peasantization in China. Probably it is not in the same way as in Latin America, where we are thinking about people urbanizing by invasions rather than by formal processes. But for example, what you mentioned about the villages being actually supposed to be in a more rural type of setting, but actually people wanting to change them in a way that maybe was not what the government intended. Is that perhaps one example of some sort of informality that you will maybe find there? Or maybe the category of informality is not that used, and maybe the most important thing is just this dichotomy between urban and rural. So maybe, yeah, it will be interesting to see if that's in the discussion of scholars and also of policymakers in China around urbanization.
Yeah, that's a very, very important question. Because in China's policy, if you look at the words China's government use, informality is never mentioned. It's not a thing considered by the policymakers in China, but you do see the similar phenomenon. Yeah, I also wonder, maybe because the scale of that kind of housing is not as big as in Peru, so it hasn't led to the change. But urban village has its very important space in the policy debate in China. I think one thing probably lead to these situations because still go back to the land system, because most of farmers, they still have their collective own land back in their village. So they always have the option to go back to village. So even those kind of in the so-called informal housings in the city is not their permanent housing. They kind of move in and out very frequently. I think that's just one of the reasons I can think of. And but the city governments in China, they of course they don't like any housings look not modern enough, like those urban village like look like a third world country. That's what they think. For them it's more about from the perspective to keep the outlook of the city better. They just try to avoid using the term informality. I think I should also do more research on like why they try to avoid use this term. Sorry, that's not a good answer. I need to think more about it.
I think it's just gonna shoot the camera. I think it's useful. I think it's interesting because it is for us just to make the comparison here. I will say in terms of policy and also in terms of academia, it is very much present. You see it also sometimes in other parts of the world. For example, perhaps in South Asia, we had a guest from India, and I think it was also part of the discussion. And in the case of China, it is not. Well, doesn't mean that there are no similar phenomena. In the text that you sent to us, there was some discussion about the slums as well. But it's also a decision. It's also something interesting to study. What is the stance of the government in relation to how to treat one phenomenon or maybe one discourse about this topic? So it's interesting. And also maybe if I can follow one thread of something that you said.
One more about the informal housing. Even informal economy is never discussed in China's policy, and there's no statistic word try to calculate how much informal economy is there in China. Although I saw there's some economists try to calculate the share of informal economy by comparing like the population in rural and urban, and so the economy in rural and urban, and just try to calculate the share of informal economy that government doesn't want to show. And there are also scholars ask like, is it possible that China's government wants rural farmers to participate more in informal economy in some way, so they don't want to calculate it or show it? I think there's some connection between informal economy and informal housing, and how Chinese government doesn't want to even talk about it. Yeah.
Interesting. So maybe just one more thing along the lines of like saying that something is happening, but actually in reality maybe something a little different happening in terms of the cities or urbanization. I was thinking that it would be maybe interesting if you could tell us a little bit about the property system in the urban areas. It was very impressive to me when I first learned about the way there is public actually ownership. I don't know if it's the government or maybe the city ownership of the land, and only some temporal rights of the families on their properties, on their houses. I think, I don't know if you will call them usufruct rights. So that's I don't know if that has a history of having a common pool of resources that is not individually owned, but actually government owned, or maybe thinking in the public welfare or in the public interest. But in practice, it being actually a very individualized system that functions maybe in a similar way of any housing market or any land market as it will work in other countries, maybe in the Western world. So I don't know if that's a correct assessment, but I think, I don't know, especially for students that maybe this is, might be a little new, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that, the specific system of property that works in the urban areas in the cities in China. I think that would be also interesting for us to hear.
So are you talking about the dual land system? Like in city area, residents doesn't own any land. Yeah, so the city government own
that system in the cities.
yeah, city government own all the land, all the urban land, and for if a urban citizen buy an apartment, they only have the property right for the housing right for 70 years. But for the rural citizens, they own a collective owned farmland, and they have the right to develop and the right to transfer, but they don't have the right to sell their collective farmland. So the collective farmland cannot be put on to the market. It's part of the product of planned economy. That has a long history. Go back to Mao Zedong's era. That because one of the important thing about planned economy is that you need to guarantee there certain amount of land just for agricultural production, and the rest is for industrial production. So because the rural residents own their collective farmland, so that's why the government expect village to be self-sufficient because they have the rights on the land. And so central government will not provide enough social goods for villages because of urban residents don't have the right to the land. So urban residents enjoy the public goods directly from the central government. So yeah, land rights and the social welfare system are tightly connected. Yeah, in this system, yeah. So that also create the paradox, like, yeah, you have the right to the land, but in the end, you actually didn't benefit from the central government's public goods provision.
I don't know if the students now have any questions. I know Jose Carlos and I would be happy to continue asking the questions, but let's see if someone else wants to chime in.
Yeah, I feel that China's like dual system can be very technical. And yeah.
Yes, Yulisa?
Yes, I was wondering, with all this like new policy that I'm not really related to, like when the Chinese government made the policies, they have like any social participation in them, or is like a more vertical, like they decide and then affect, because you said that they don't have really the right of the land. So I suppose it's more like a vertical, but all these policies are making a social like participation for this side, or there is no chance of it.
So are you talking about the three policies I mentioned in the last slide?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's another very good question. For the so what happened during the beginning of 2000, when China started to have very radical urban expansion, is that many central government take away take away farmers' land without enough compensation. So there's actually a massive scale of farmer protests in early 2000. That definitely leads to central government to reconsider their urban expansion strategy. And one very important thing at that time is to increase the compensations local government need to pay for the farmers. And then I think the rural reconstruction movement is an iteration from it's a compromise between, like, you can keep having land development without taking away the land from the farmers. And rural reconstruction movement also has its own history in Communist Party, because Communist Party usually, like, they will claim the foundational parties from the farmers. So to initiate the project based on village or based on the rights of farmers will make a policy more popular among the civil society. So that's also one important reason that the central government ended up coming up with the rural reconstruction movement. But the farmer protests in early 2000s is definitely an important reason that lead to central government's policy.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
I'm giving a chance for other questions to come up.
Maybe I can add something connected to what the last question was posing in relation to the government, and maybe how top down or how vertical the decisions are taken. For example, in the news, I think in Peru, in the US, in the last weeks, there's been some news about the last gathering and meeting of the Communist Party in China, and I was wondering, those decisions, or maybe those decision makers at the national level, how much does that influence the decisions at the local level? Or at the local level, are there, when administering or managing a city, more autonomous space for the politicians to decide on how a city is going to develop, what is going to be the decision of where everything is going to be located, or even how are the local politicians elected? So maybe we could have maybe an idea of you, so we can connect that to some of the things that we've seen in the news in the recent time.
Yeah. So yes, I would say how the central government make their decisions still a black box for most of political scientists. What people can really study is how policy from central government got transformed and interpreted differently at the local level, and that's the only thing we can study. But what happened just within the central party, we have no idea. And the last party congress just have made many political science claim that it's the end of an era when the central government give lots of space for local government to improvise. Many people believe the era has ended, and now we are facing a more totalizing style of government. And I think you bring a very important aspect of how official was selected or promoted in the system. That has a huge influence on the trajectory of urban development. So every a few years, government will change the evaluation system for local governments. In the past, probably GDP will be the first, and social protest probably be the second. And so local government will try to maximize their performance based on these criteria. So first, they want to have high GDP through land development, and then they try to avoid local protests as much as possible, because any big protest will immediately eliminate your promotion path. So that's a very important way to understanding how local governments interact with the central government. And in the past few years, one big change is the environment evaluation. So GDP probably, so environment can now become the second evaluation criteria. So on the one hand, there's good effect of this evaluation, but on the other hand, it also leads to some very skewed way of development or unfaithful report of local economy to a central government, when everything was when every performance was abstracted to those evaluation criteria. Local government probably, for example, they want to maximize the environmental protection. They will even shut down some village industries in order to achieve the carbon emission detection in sacrifice of local economy. So that kind of thing happen in China a lot. Local government, in order to get promoted and to meet the criteria and do something in sacrifice of other people's livelihood. Yeah.
Thank you for, I think, yes, the political context, the way in which the government is organized, the system of governance, both at the national level but at local level, have a very big impact in all these things. And I think that's something that it's something that's come up in our conversations, I think, a few times. I remember one of the first classes that we had with the students, that was one of the topics that we were actually discussing. So it's interesting to see how different governance structures in different countries have also different impacts, but at the same time, maybe some of the same issues in navigating this relationship between different levels of government. I had one more question, but I don't know if it's I don't know, it might be a very a kind of a hard question, but I'm still gonna pose it, and maybe feel free to elaborate or not. So I was thinking, related to your first slides, you were talking about this relationship between a rural to urban transformation, but also an agricultural to industrial transformation. And I think that relationship between urbanization and industrialization is something that has happened in some countries, and it would seem, as you were saying in your presentation, that that's the case in China. It's also been the case maybe in several countries in Europe, in countries in the US also. And I was wondering, and this is why I think maybe it's a hard question, so feel free to comment on any part of what I'm saying, is other countries in South America or the global South have had urbanization that's not linked to industrialization. So I was just wondering, how does that impact how this urbanization is perceived? And I think it links back to the question of using the word urban informality or not, because this it would seem that a lot of this migration is happening to accommodate for this like industrialization and all these like economic processes that are very like normative, probably a lot of them led by the state or promoted by the government. On the other hand, in this other context where a lot of migration or urbanization is happening, that's not linked to industrialization, it's not linked to sort of like the political economy or the main economic discourse happening in the country. And it's kind of a maybe weird, not very well posed question, but I was just thinking, what are your thoughts about all these different things I laid out?
Yeah, like urbanization without industrialization, that's a very important topic. And I was preparing for my exam and I look into the term over urbanization. It's a very important topic between 1950 to 1970s. And UNESCO has a report talking about most of the third world countries in Asia and South Africa, they are all over urbanized because their urbanization pace has surpassed the industrialization pace. And the interesting thing is that all these policy report mention the solution for over urbanization is to improve the agricultural sector, like either increase the agricultural export or improve the technology in agricultural sector. And green revolution is actually one of the policy that accompany the over urbanization discussion. So yeah, like so I found it fascinating that over urbanization has such a close relationship to agricultural for rural modernization discussion. So if you cannot keep the pace of urbanization and industrialization, it seems like those it is recommended to improve the rural areas instead. That actually match with what Chinese government want to do with the rural reconstruction. That's my answer. So I don't know, like if in Peru, government has ever tried to do anything with the agricultural sector or village in order to solve the problem of informal settlements in the city?
Actually, that's a good question. The impression that I have is that most of the policies are centered on what you're doing within the city, and not that much the balance between the biggest city, Lima, with the other cities, and perhaps even less with giving some space for I don't know, policies to the agrarian sector. I think, but that's I think a interesting topic. Yeah, that's a good thing to consider in the case of Peru.
Yes, and I think there's been some policies or projects to try to increase the like agricultural production, but it's not linked to like urban informality or quote unquote over urbanization. So there have been some efforts to improve agricultural production and exportation, I believe, in different parts. Like I'm thinking of very large projects promoted by the government in Arequipa and also in the north of Peru. But at the same time, they are not linked at all, from my perception at least, to like urbanization processes. Yes, so I think that's
Yeah,
a very interesting point you're making.
and also yeah, when I read the discussion about over-urbanization in 1950s to 70s, there's also some scholars argue that it's because of the dependency, like the world system, make the developing country cannot invest the invest the profits from industry back to their domestic country, which leads to urbanization without industrialization. Because at that time, most of the industry in developing countries is from foreign capital, and they take away the profits of industry away rather than allow the developing country to use it back to invest their country. So that's why there's urbanization without industrialization. So yeah, I'm not very organizing answering this.
No, I think that's very interesting. Like bringing the global scale and the whole like geopolitics of global south, global north, developing countries versus developed countries. I think that's all part of the discussion. I don't think maybe we've talked about it explicitly in the class so far. Maybe a little bit, but I don't think it's maybe been as clear. But bringing it into the conversation and being aware that all these different processes also impact very local, like can have a very localized impact in different places. I think it's very interesting.
Yeah,
Maybe, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
yeah, I think if you only talk about urbanization process, you can talk in the national scale, but if you talk about industrialization, you have to think in a global system. And over urbanization is really talking about how these two processes are not synchronized.
Yeah, I think those are very interesting points to continue having in mind when we're having these discussions of the localized impact. I think maybe we can have maybe one last question regarding the conducting research from the US in China. I think some of your master's degree thesis was about Indonesia, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
So maybe just like a few comments about how to navigate this, about conducting research from the US or quote unquote the global north about like other countries in the world. I think that would be maybe interesting to have a very short conversation about that.
Yeah, probably some of the students or many of the students here in this class eventually will go somewhere else, maybe the United States or somewhere else to do their masters or their doctoral studies. So it would be nice to hear your experience, since you're also, even though you're working in the US, you're looking back to also the China experience. Yeah, that would be a useful thing to maybe close the session.
Yeah, I think I definitely benefit a lot from studying projects in very different political system like China. It's not a democratic system, but also in many cases China also is much less like totalizing than most of people think they are. The local autonomy is an interesting thing to study more on, like how local autonomy was allowed and how it was limited in many ways. And I'm still, I think, but studying China or Indonesia in US, I think the most challenge is that how to make people care about it, or to make people think, oh, there are some lessons they can learn. And by the comparison, you can also start to realize more like what is so special about like China's experience, or what is universal in China's experience. And I think that's the comparative aspect can really benefit, I think, every scholar. Yeah, so my current research is more about the early stage China's ambition in doing rural modernization. It's almost like radical agrarian radicalism, and it has its huge potential, but it also has its limits. So that's a tension I want to look on, and I do believe, as we keep seeing more over urbanization, government will start to look more things they can do in the rural areas, and there's something we can learn from the history. Yeah, so it's quite tied to what we have discussed.
Yeah, I think some of the maybe challenges to researching from sort of afar is sometimes conducting like field work. No, I think that's maybe one of the challenges that, at least for me, it's like I'm trying to figure out how that's gonna go. On the other hand, maybe I think that distance can also help with reflection. I don't know if that's your experience, but yeah, for me at least, I think like having a little distance can help you see a bigger picture than what you maybe see sometimes when you are embedded in the processes you are researching. So yes, and maybe can you talk a little bit more about your research? I think you mentioned it's kind of a historical research, so I'm guessing there's a lot of like archival work. Maybe talk about the challenges of that, and or the opportunities as well, if they're like something helpful.
Yeah, pandemic definitely make field work and many things very hard for me. I think I came to the program want to study more contemporary rural experiments. But one of the reasons I become more like historical do a historical projects, because I cannot really visit the site. And I think searching for archive is also fun. And sometimes the so for now I'm so Harvard has we have been very benefit from the huge Chinese collection here. So the archive here has allowed me to do some preliminary research, but in the end I still need to go back to China to talk with local people. But you talk about the distance. That's something I'm still like wrestling with. And in academic, we talk about there's actors category and analyst category. For example, the rural reconstruction movement from the perspective of farmers, from the perspective of local cadres, and from scholars' perspective can be so different. And what's a normative you want to use? Like how you evaluate if this project is successful or not. It needs scholars to first think about like what's your positionality. And I think being in China or being in US will change your positionality a lot when you evaluate this project. I also personally still digesting this. Yeah. I think it's not only about scholarship, also about like your moral position. And, yeah.
Thank you for mentioning that. So all of our students are conducting short research this semester, and I think we haven't really discussed that or I think I might be wrong, but I think we haven't really discussed this idea of like positioning ourselves as researchers, like in relation to the topic we are researching. So thank you for bringing that up. I think that's something that's very important when we're conducting, especially when we're conducting like maybe longer, more in-depth, like scholarly work, but also it's something interesting to keep in mind even when we're doing short projects. So I think that's a very important point to make, and thank you for bringing that up. Jose Carlos, I don't know if you have any additional questions or comments.
No, I don't think so. I think it's been really nice, and there are also many things, also for me and even for my research, to reflect about this idea of urbanization. For example, I had not read that much about it, and I also relate a little to what you both were saying in relation to your position or positionality of your research from the perspective of being researching or working in the US. So yeah, that's super interesting things. Yeah, I like where the conversation went. So thank you for that, Ziwei. So yeah, I think it was super good. We went a little over an hour, but I think it was nice. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation a lot.
Yes, thank you so much, Ziwei, for coming here and for this very interesting conversation. And it was great to see you after such a long time as well.
Hope we'll meet in person sometimes.
Hopefully, yes.
Thank you, Ziwei.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's give a round of applause to our guest.
Okay. See you guys. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.